Latin America has always been a vibrant region, full of music, idyllic beaches, award-winning cuisine, and people who welcome tourists with open smiles. But what if behind this image of bright colors and festivals lies a much more complex and delicate reality? This video is part of our series here on the channel, What's Happening?, where we dive deep into the current realities of countries that many people think they know well, but that almost no one shows how they really are. And now it's time to look at Latin America, a region famous for its incredible landscapes and rich culture, but which in recent months has faced deep crises: rising authoritarian governments, out-of-control urban violence, a collapsing economy, mass deportations, and devastating natural disasters. Today on Bello Mundo, we go beyond the postcards, the beaches of Cancún, the Argentine tango, and the Brazilian carnival, to truly understand what is happening in the countries of Latin America. Number 1. The Great Deportation. Today, we begin our tour with a scene that has become routine in recent months and is shaking all of Latin America. Since January, crowded planes have been landing daily, bringing thousands of Latin Americans deported from the United States. Trump's return to the White House has reignited the policy of mass expulsions, and with it, the American dream has turned into a nightmare for many people. In Guatemala, the number of deportations rose by 340% in the first months of 2025 alone. In Honduras, entire families are returning with no money, no direction, and nowhere to stay, putting even more pressure on public services that are already struggling. In Mexico, the crisis is visible in border towns, people stuck in shelters, trying to return home or waiting for a new chance to cross. But perhaps the most controversial case involves El Salvador. The United States now pays around $6 million for the country to take in deported Venezuelans and lock them up in Sicote, Bukele's maximum security prison, which has sparked controversy and a legal impasse in the United States itself. The scariest part? Many of those sent there have never had the right to a trial. There is not always proof of involvement in crime. According to Amnesty International, among the more than 110,000 prisoners under the Salvadoran state of emergency, hundreds are innocent people who have been arbitrarily detained. And the impact of all these deportations goes beyond the human drama. Countries such as Venezuela and El Salvador depend heavily on remittances sent by their citizens living abroad. In Venezuela alone, this money amounts to almost $4 billion a year. Each deportation is a bill that doesn't arrive, and for many families, it's the beginning of a new financial collapse. And since we're talking about El Salvador, let's talk a little more about what's happening there. Number 2. El Salvador. Of all the recent stories in Latin America, perhaps none has attracted as much attention as the transformation of El Salvador into an open-air prison. Nayib Bukele, the media-savvy president who loves a slim-fit suit and digital superhero poses, has initiated a zero-tolerance policy against crime and put it into practice with a state of emergency that has lasted more than 2 years. The result? Arrest without a warrant, state surveillance of private messages, imprisonment without access to a lawyer. All of this has become routine. From March 2024 to the present, the number of prisoners has jumped from 36 to over 110,000. This means that about 2% of the country's adult population is behind bars. It is the highest incarceration rate in the world. The symbol of this policy is the Sicote, which we mentioned earlier, a mega prison complex where inmates live in total isolation. No visits, letters, or phone calls. For families, it is as if the inmates have simply disappeared, and sometimes they do. According to the NGO Cristosal, 174 violent deaths have already been recorded inside prisons, many of them with clear signs of torture. Even so, Bukele is riding a wave of popularity. For many, he is the first to finally bring a sense of security. But for many others, it is just a smokescreen for a new form of control in a disguised dictatorship. Number 3. Venezuela. If El Salvador is the laboratory of authoritarianism, Venezuela is the manual on how to destroy a country in record time. 25 years after Hugo Chavez came to power, the country that was once one of the most prosperous nations in Latin America has become synonymous with exodus. More than 7 million Venezuelans, almost a quarter of the population, have fled the country. It is one of the largest migration crises in modern history, surpassing Syria in absolute numbers. The economic situation borders on surrealism. A country with the largest oil reserves in the world cannot guarantee electricity for its population. Hospitals operate without basic medicines, schools close due to a lack of teachers, and the middle class has simply evaporated. Nicolás Maduro remains in power through a toxic combination of brutal repression of opponents, total control of information, and a network of loyalties bought with what little resources remain. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González, lives in hiding or in exile. The most tragic thing: the international community seems to have become accustomed to the chaos in Venezuela. Protests that once mobilized the world now barely earn a note of condemnation. Number 4. Haiti. If you think the situation in Venezuela is serious, you need to know about Haiti. The Caribbean country no longer functions as a traditional state. It has become a territory dominated by armed gangs that impose their own rules. Today, about 80% of the capital, Port-au-Prince, is under the control of these militias. The government, weakened and without functional security forces, can barely leave the presidential palace. Schools, hospitals, markets, everything only functions with the authorization of local bosses. It is as if the country has returned to the Middle Ages, with feudal lords armed to the teeth. Violence has reached almost indescribable levels. Sexual violence is used as a tool of intimidation. Kidnappings have become routine, even of children, who are often forced to serve as soldiers or lookouts. Those who have any chance of escaping flee. Those who don't try to survive amid the chaos. The much-talked-about international aid force has barely gotten off the ground. The country is in such a critical situation that even the peacekeeping mission has been unable to establish itself. The few agents who landed were faced with a territory without structure, without command, and without the minimum conditions for operation. And now, in a desperate attempt, the Haitian government has hired Eric Prince, former founder of the private military company Blackwater, the one involved in controversies in Iraq, to lead a parallel operation against the gangs. The plan? To use drones, helicopters, and even foreign mercenaries to try to regain control of the streets. Prince, a former informal advisor to Donald Trump, will work with a private team parallel to the UN force. The news has raised alarms among human rights groups who fear abuses and indiscriminate use of force among an already vulnerable population. Today, Haiti is not just a country in crisis. It is a territory where the state has collapsed, justice has disappeared, and no one talks about this forgotten piece of the map. Number 5. Argentina. From political crisis, we move straight into an economic crisis, and a big one at that. Argentina is going through yet another turbulent phase of the many it has already faced. Only this time, the remedy seems to be hurting more than helping. Javier Milei arrived promising a libertarian revolution to put the country back on track. But in practice, this meant cutting entire ministries, suspending public works, reducing social programs, and letting the market act alone, as if it could handle everything. The result? In the first few months, inflation rose to over 200% per year. Poverty exceeded half the population. In Buenos Aires, it is common to see lines of people waiting for free food, and a large part of the population now lives without any support network. Milei believes that after the storm comes the calm. But for now, most Argentines are only feeling the impact of the cuts. And with a history of 9 foreign debt defaults, many people are already wondering when the 10th will come. The government has also been hit by scandals that weaken its discourse against old-style politics. The most talked about is Cryptogate. The president allegedly publicly encouraged a cryptocurrency that ended up crashing, leaving investors at a loss. The case has already generated more than 100 complaints in court. There were also complaints from employees of PAMI, an agency that provides services to retirees, saying they were pressured to pass on part of their salary to Milei's party. And recently, the so-called food scandal came to light. Tons of food were stockpiled and expired while the population went hungry, in addition to suspicious contracts and extra salaries paid without criteria. All this in the midst of the worst crisis in decades. The people are trying to survive, while the government promises that one day everything will get better. Number 6. Brazil. Brazil, the largest country in Latin America, continues to deal with its own ghosts. Even after the 2022 election that removed Bolsonaro from power, the country remains deeply divided. Lula returned to the Planalto, but found a very different scenario from his first terms. Polarization has increased, the economy is stalled, and extremist groups remain active. The events of January 8th, when radicals stormed the three powers, made it clear that democracy here is still fragile. Political violence has not disappeared. Threats, disinformation, and attacks on the polls continue to circulate among radical groups. It is as if the institutions function, but part of the population simply refuses to accept the democratic game. And as if that weren't enough, in recent years, the country has seen the growth of a silent and dangerous fever: online gambling. Games such as the famous Fortune Tiger have spread among young people, workers, and even entire families with promises of easy money. Driven by influencers and aggressive advertising, these virtual slot machines have become a national addiction. The impact is brutal. It is estimated that in just 1 year, Brazilians lost almost 24 billion reais in bets. For many, it has become their only source of income. Data shows that almost 13% of the population tries to supplement their income with betting. But this comes at a price. Compulsive gambling has led to extreme cases, including suicides related to debt. And those most affected, of course, are always the most vulnerable. Amid this scenario, in 2025, another blow came. The scandal involving the INSS, the agency responsible for paying pensions, retirement benefits, and social assistance. More than 6 billion reais were embezzled between 2019 and 2024. Almost 98% of the victims said they never authorized anything. Number 7. Colombia. Colombia lives in a constant paradox. On the one hand, it is one of the most politically stable countries in Latin America. On the other, it remains the world's largest producer of cocaine and bears the scars of this reality to this day. Gustavo Petro, the first left-wing president in the country's history, came to power with the promise of total peace. The idea was to negotiate with all armed groups still active in the territory. But since the end of the FARC, what has emerged is a host of new factions, smaller, more volatile, and even less willing to engage in dialogue. The violence has not diminished, it has only changed its face. In regions such as Cauca and Nariño, state control is minimal. The real power lies with local armed groups, and the law is enforced with bullets. In addition to the armed conflict, Petro also faces resistance in Congress, the judiciary, and even within the armed forces. His reform projects are hampered by political obstacles and mistrust. And in recent months, this tension has spilled onto the streets. At the end of May 2025, trade unions called a 48-hour national strike to pressure the Senate to pass a broader labor reform and to try to push through a referendum that had been blocked. However, the strike lost momentum on the second day. This was because, on the eve of the strike, the Senate approved a leaner version of the reform with some specific advances, such as a 100% bonus for those who work on Sundays and holidays, and the extension of night hours from 7 p.m. onwards. The government base celebrated this small advance. The opposition, however, said that it was all just a show to fuel Petro's campaign rhetoric and that the popular consultation was just another political ploy. Meanwhile, Colombia remains in turmoil, trying to break out of the cycle of violence without repeating the mistakes of the past and trying to change without tearing itself apart. It is a country that lives between the promise of peace and the fear of never achieving it. Number 8. Chile. If there is one thing we can say about Chile, it is that the country seemed ready for a revolution, but it got stuck halfway there. For a long time, Chile was the darling of Latin America. It had an organized economy, solid institutions, and a democracy considered a model. But that image began to crack in October 2019. When a 30 Chilean peso increase in the subway fare, equivalent to less than 4 cents, lit a powder keg that was already full. What seemed like a revolt against transportation turned into a collective cry against decades of inequality and social injustice. It was called the Estallido Social, an uprising that brought millions to the streets, forced the government to promise change, and paved the way for a new political generation. Amidst all this, Gabriel Boric emerged, a former student leader with the face of renewal. He was elected president in 2021 with more than 55% of the vote, promising to respond to the discontent in the streets. But the road proved much more difficult than it seemed. Boric's biggest promise was a new constitution, a text that would replace the one inherited from the Pinochet dictatorship. But the text was rejected in 2 referendums, one in 2022 and another in 2023. The population wanted change, but not just any change. Chile came to a standstill. Meanwhile, the country faces a growing security crisis. In 2022, the number of homicides rose by more than 30%. In the north, groups linked to drug trafficking are advancing on routes and entire cities, taking advantage of the vacuum left by the state. The economic outlook is also worrying. Copper is still the mainstay of the economy, accounting for more than 60% of Chilean exports. This dependence leaves the country vulnerable to the moods of the international market. Inequality remains enormous. The richest 5% earn more than 800 times the income of the poorest 5%. Today, Boric has an approval rating of only 22%. The youth who elected him are frustrated, and conservatives want revenge. Chile continues to function, but without a clear direction, trying to balance the desire for change with the fear of losing what it has achieved. Number 9. Peru. To close our tour of events in Latin America, let's talk about Peru. While Machu Picchu remains high in the mountains, standing firm and intact for centuries, the same cannot be said of the governments that have passed through Lima. Since 2002, Peru has been unable to stand on its own 2 feet. There have been more than 20 years of political crises, presidents overthrown, scandals, and a constant feeling that the country is in a perpetual state of transition. To give you an idea, between 2016 and 2023, the country had 6 different presidents. And that's not counting those who tried to stay in office by force. In December 2022, Pedro Castillo attempted to shut down Congress and staged a miscalculated self-coup. He was arrested within hours. Dina Boluarte took over, also facing massive protests and going down in history with more than 60 deaths in clashes with demonstrators. The division between the elite in Lima and the indigenous peoples in the interior has never been so visible or so bloody. But the chaos is not only institutional. Peru has become one of the main cocaine trafficking corridors on the continent. With the FARC out of the picture in Colombia, international cartels have migrated en masse to Peruvian territory, where they have encountered little resistance and plenty of room to operate. At the same time, illegal mining is devastating entire regions of the Andean Amazon, often under the protection of armed militias. Corruption, which was already structural, has become almost cultural. Congressmen, governors, mayors, former presidents, few escape allegations. And trust in institutions is crumbling, along with the patience of the population. In the economy, the promise of stability is a thing of the past. Peru has entered a recession, unemployment has risen, inflation is hitting people's pockets, and the middle class, which grew in the 2000 years, is now regressing. Instead of moving up in life, families are returning to the bottom of the pyramid. Peru has become the starkest portrait of Latin American instability, a country with everything going for it, and yet it continues to go wrong. To sum it up in a few words, you could say that Latin America is living on a knife edge. And so we end this journey, not a tourist trip, behind the scenes of our continent. A place of almost developed, almost fair, almost democratic, almost safe. And the question remains, how long can we live in this almost without falling off the cliff? And for you, which of these stories surprised you the most? Comment below, and while you're at it, like and share. See you next time.